Tonight, we're going to explore something that might surprise you about pirates. You know those rough, lawless men of the sea? The ones who supposedly had no rules, no structure, no order? Well, that's not quite the whole story. In fact, pirates had some of the most detailed, democratic, and surprisingly fair codes of conduct you could imagine for their time. These weren't just guidelines scribbled on a napkin. These were serious documents, sworn oaths, binding contracts that could mean the difference between life and death. So settle in, get comfortable, and let your mind drift back to the early 1700s. Picture yourself standing on a weathered dock in Port Royal, Jamaica. The sun is setting over the Caribbean, painting the water in shades of amber and gold. You can smell the salt in the air, mixed with tar and rum. Ships creak in the harbor, their masts swaying gently. And somewhere in a dark tavern behind you, men are gathering around a table, about to sign something that will change their lives forever. Let me tell you about the Pirate Code. You might be wondering where this all started. How did a bunch of outlaws, criminals, and rebels end up creating one of the most democratic systems of their era? The answer takes us back even further, to the buccaneers of the mid-1600s. These weren't quite pirates yet. They were something in between privateers and outlaws, operating in that gray area where the law got fuzzy. The buccaneers had something they called the chasse partie. In French, this meant chase party, but it was really an agreement about how to divide plunder. Imagine you're on a ship with 50 other men. You're about to attack a Spanish galleon loaded with silver. Before you do, everyone needs to know what they're going to get. Otherwise, why risk your life? The chasse partie laid it all out. How much the captain gets, how much the surgeon gets, how much compensation you'll receive if you lose an arm or a leg in battle. This wasn't written in fancy legal language. It was practical, straightforward. If you lose your right arm, you get 600 pieces of 8. If you lose your left arm, you get 500. Clear as day. No ambiguity, no arguments later. The buccaneers based their chasse partie on even older maritime traditions. There were the rolls of Oleron from the 12th century, a set of sea laws that governed European shipping. Before that, there were joint hands agreements between merchants and sailors in medieval times. The idea was simple. Everyone who contributed to a voyage deserved a fair share of the profits. This wasn't charity or kindness. It was practical economics. If you want men to risk their lives at sea, you need to make it worth their while. As buccaneering turned into full-blown piracy in the late 1600s and early 1700s, these agreements evolved. They got more detailed, more structured. Different captains had different versions, but they all shared certain core principles. And these principles, interestingly enough, were far more democratic than anything you'd find in the legitimate navies or merchant fleets of the time. Let's paint a picture of what life was like on a regular merchant ship or Royal Navy vessel in the early 1700s. The captain was essentially a king. He had absolute authority. He lived in a comfortable cabin, ate the best food, and could have men flogged for the smallest infractions. The officers lived almost as well. But the common sailors? They slept in hammocks, crammed together in the forecastle or gun deck. They ate weevil-infested hardtack and salt beef that was like chewing leather. They were beaten, underpaid, and often had their wages withheld for months or even years. It's no wonder that when pirates captured a merchant ship, Many of the sailors voluntarily joined the pirate crew. Life as a pirate was dangerous, sure. You could be hanged if caught. But at least you had a say in how things were run. At least you knew you'd get your fair share of whatever treasure you captured. At least you wouldn't be flogged at the whim of some tyrant captain. The pirate code developed as a response to the brutal conditions on legitimate ships. Men who had suffered under harsh captains didn't want to create the same system when they went on the account, as they called becoming a pirate. They wanted something fairer, something more equal, and so they created it. Picture a typical scene. A group of sailors has just seized a ship. Maybe they were already pirates who captured a prize. Maybe they were merchant sailors who mutinied. Either way, they now have a vessel and a chance to start fresh. What's the first thing they do? They elect a captain. Yes, you heard that right. Pirates elected their captains. This wasn't like the Navy, where your captain was appointed from above. Probably some nobleman's son who'd never actually worked a ship, but had the right family connections. No, pirate crews voted. Every man had an equal say. They chose someone who actually knew how to sail, how to fight, how to lead. And if that captain turned out to be a coward or a tyrant, they could vote him out just as easily. This democratic system wasn't just about voting for the captain. It extended to major decisions about the ship: where to sail, put it to a vote; whether to attack a particular vessel, put it to a vote; how to divide the plunder, you guessed it, put it to a vote. Now, this wasn't a pure democracy in the modern sense. The captain still had authority, especially in battle. When cannonballs were flying and you needed split-second decisions, you couldn't stop to hold a town hall meeting. In those moments, the captain's word was law. But outside of combat, his power was severely limited. And there was another crucial role that balanced the captain's authority: the quartermaster. Think of the quartermaster as a combination of prime minister, judge, and union representative. He was elected by the crew, just like the captain. But while the captain commanded during battle, the quartermaster handled everything else. He distributed provisions. He settled disputes. He kept an eye on the captain to make sure he wasn't abusing his power. If someone had a complaint, they went to the quartermaster. If two men had a quarrel, the quartermaster mediated. If someone got injured and needed their compensation, the quartermaster made sure they received it. This dual leadership system was a form of checks and balances. One man couldn't have complete control. The captain led in war, but the quartermaster led in peace. Both answered to the crew. Both could be removed by vote. It was a remarkably sophisticated system for a bunch of supposed outlaws. Let me tell you about a man named Bartholomew Roberts. You might know him as Black Bart. He was Welsh, born in 1682, and he became one of the most successful pirates in history. In just 3 years of piracy, from 1719 to 1722, he captured over 400 ships. 400. That's more than one ship every 3 days. How did he manage this? Partly through skill and daring, yes, but also through organization. Black Bart understood that a well-run ship with clear rules and happy crew was far more effective than a chaotic mess of fighting, drunken thieves. Roberts didn't start out as a pirate. He was a legitimate sailor, a ship's mate, captured by pirates in 1719 when his vessel was seized near the coast of Africa. At first, he was reluctant. But 6 weeks later, the pirate captain who'd captured him, a man named Howell Davis, was killed in an ambush while trying to kidnap the governor of Principe Island. The crew needed a new captain. They voted, and they chose Roberts. Why him? He'd only been with them 6 weeks. But he was competent, smart, sober. Unlike many pirates who drank themselves into a stupor at every opportunity, Roberts preferred tea. He understood navigation and seamanship, and crucially, he understood people. He knew that if you wanted men to follow you into danger, you needed to treat them fairly. Shortly after becoming captain, Roberts and his crew drew up their articles of agreement. These were the rules they would all swear to follow. Roberts probably based them on articles from his predecessor, Davis, but he added his own touches. The result was one of the most comprehensive pirate codes we have record of. Before we dive into the specific rules, let's talk about how these articles were created and enforced. This wasn't something the captain just dictated from on high. No, the entire crew participated. They'd gather on deck or in the largest cabin. Someone, usually the captain or quartermaster, would propose a set of articles based on previous codes they'd sailed under. Then the crew would discuss them, argue about them, suggest changes. I think the captain should only get 1.5 shares, not 2. No, 2 is fair. He takes the most risk. What about compensation for losing an eye? Should it be the same as losing a finger? More, you only have 2 eyes. Back and forth it would go until everyone was satisfied. Then they'd write it all down. And here's where it gets interesting. Every single man had to sign it. Or if you couldn't write, you'd make your mark, an X or some other symbol. This wasn't optional. If you wanted to be part of the crew, you signed the articles. But it was more than just signing. There was an oath, usually sworn on a Bible, though some crews used other objects. John Phillips' crew, lacking a Bible, swore their oath on an axe. Other crews used crossed pistols, or a cannon, or even a human skull. The object didn't matter as much as the act of swearing. You were making a solemn vow before your fellow pirates and whatever god you believed in. These articles weren't just rules, they were sacred. Once signed, the articles would be posted somewhere visible, often nailed to the door of the captain's cabin. This way, any man could look at them and remind himself of what he'd agreed to. It also served as a warning. These were the rules. Break them, and you'd face the consequences. And the consequences could be severe. We'll get into punishments in more detail later, but understand that the pirate code wasn't just suggestions. It had teeth. Break the rules about fighting on board, and you'd be whipped. Steal from your crewmates, and you'd be marooned on a deserted island. Desert your post in battle, and you'd be hanged. The pirates didn't mess around, but here's what's fascinating. These harsh punishments were applied equally. It didn't matter if you were the newest recruit or a senior officer. The rules were the same for everyone. Compare that to the Royal Navy, where officers could be court-martialed for crimes that would get a common sailor hanged. Or where a captain could have a man flogged for backtalk, but face no consequences himself for brutality. The pirate code was built on a simple principle: fairness. Every man deserved an equal share of the plunder, unless his position required more responsibility. Every man deserved an equal voice in major decisions. Every man deserved to be treated with basic dignity. These weren't lofty ideals about human rights or democracy. They were practical rules for survival. A crew that felt cheated would mutiny. A crew that was happy and felt they were being treated fairly would fight harder, work smarter,
and stick together through difficult times.
Let's talk about some of the common elements that appeared in most pirate codes, regardless of which captain drew them up. First and foremost was the distribution of plunder. This was the whole reason most men turned pirate in the first place. They wanted treasure, wealth, a chance to escape poverty. The articles specified exactly how captured goods would be divided. Typically, the captain received 2 shares. The quartermaster got 1.5 or 1 3/4. Other officers, like the master, boatswain, and gunner, might get 1 1/4 shares. Everyone else received 1 share each. This might not seem very democratic, but compare it to merchant ships, where the captain might make 10 times what a common sailor earned, or Royal Navy vessels, where the pay disparity was even worse. On a pirate ship, the captain earned double what a regular crew member got. That's it. And everyone agreed this was fair because the captain carried the most responsibility. He was the one who'd hang if they were caught. He was the one making the life or death decisions in battle. 2 shares seemed reasonable. But the articles made something else very clear. No prey, no pay. This was an old buccaneer saying that carried forward into piracy. If you didn't capture anything, nobody got anything. The pirates operated on pure meritocracy. You only prospered if the entire crew prospered. This aligned everyone's interests. It meant that every man had a stake in the success of each raid. Another common element was compensation for injuries. This was crucial. Life at sea was dangerous even in peaceful times. Add in naval battles, and the risk of injuries skyrocketed. Cannonballs didn't discriminate. A splinter from an exploding mast could kill as easily as a musket ball. Men knew that every raid might be their last, or might leave them crippled. So the articles specified exact compensation for specific injuries. If you lost your right arm in battle, you'd receive 600 pieces of eight. Left arm, 500 pieces of eight. Right leg, 500. Left leg, 400. Lost an eye, 100 pieces of eight. Even losing a finger had a set price, usually around the same as an eye. Why the difference between right and left limbs? Simple practicality. Most men were right-handed. Losing your right arm was more debilitating than losing your left. The pirates understood this and compensated accordingly. It wasn't about being fair in some abstract sense. It was about accurately valuing the loss. This compensation system was revolutionary for its time. Remember, this is the early 1700s. There were no workers' compensation laws, no disability insurance. If you worked on a merchant ship and got injured, tough luck. Maybe the ship owner would give you some charity if he was feeling generous. Maybe not. But pirates guaranteed it in writing, signed by everyone. The articles also covered discipline and punishment. Gambling was often restricted or banned entirely because it led to fights. Lights and candles had to be out by 8 o'clock to prevent fire, which was every sailor's nightmare on a wooden ship packed with gunpowder and tar. Weapons had to be kept clean and ready for action. Desertion in battle was punishable by death or marooning. One of the most interesting rules appeared in many codes. No striking another man aboard ship. Arguments were bound to happen when you crammed dozens of men into a small wooden vessel for months at a time. But fighting on board could quickly spiral out of control, damaging ship, morale, everything. So the rule was clear. If you had a quarrel with another man, you took it ashore, and you did it properly. The quartermaster would arrange it. He'd accompany both men to shore with witnesses. The disputants would stand back to back, walk a certain number of paces away from each other, turn, and fight, usually with pistol and sword. First the pistol shot. If both men survived that, they'd draw swords and go at it until one man yielded or died. This sounds barbaric to modern ears, but it was actually a remarkably civilized way to handle disputes. It kept violence off the ship. It made sure fights were fair, supervised, with clear rules. And most importantly, it meant the rest of the crew wasn't endangered by two hotheads brawling in the middle of the deck. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. The Pirate Code also addressed something that might surprise you: women. Most pirate articles included a clause forbidding women aboard the ship. This wasn't about misogyny exactly, though that certainly played a part. It was practical. The pirates believed that having women aboard would cause jealousy and fighting among the crew. One man's girlfriend would become a source of tension. Multiple women would lead to competition. It was simpler and safer to just ban them entirely. Bartholomew Roberts' articles put it this way: "No boy or woman to be allowed amongst them. If any man were to be found seducing any of the latter sex and carried her to sea disguised, he was to suffer death." Death. That's how serious they were about this rule. And yes, women did sometimes disguise themselves as men to go to sea. Some of them even became successful pirates. But if you were caught smuggling a woman aboard disguised, you'd be executed. The woman's fate was left to the mercy of the crew, which probably wasn't merciful. Interestingly, the same articles that banned women aboard also protected women they encountered. Roberts' 9th article stated, "If at any time you meet with a prudent woman, that man that offers to meddle with her without her consent shall suffer present death." Rape was punishable by immediate execution. This wasn't because pirates were particularly enlightened about women's rights. It was, again, practical. Raping captives caused problems. It made future victims fight harder. It damaged your reputation, which was important if you wanted ships to surrender without a fight. And it could lead to disease. John Phillips, who served under Thomas Anstis before striking out on his own, included a similar anti-rape clause in his articles. Phillips had witnessed a horrific gang rape and murder committed by Anstis's crew. When he drew up his own code, he specifically forbade it. The punishment? Death. So the Pirate Code was this strange mix of brutal and surprisingly progressive. Death for bringing women aboard, but also death for raping them. Democratic elections for officers, but harsh punishments for infractions. Generous compensation for injuries, but marooning for theft. It all made sense in its context. These were men living outside the law, operating in one of the most dangerous professions imaginable, crammed together on a small ship for months at a time. They needed rules to survive. They needed rules to keep from killing each other. They needed rules to make sure everyone was treated fairly, so nobody would mutiny. And they needed those rules to be binding, enforceable, with real consequences. Think about it for a moment. You're a pirate in 1721. You've just signed the Articles. You've sworn your oath on a Bible, or an axe, or crossed pistols. You know the rules. You know that if you steal from the common pot, you'll be marooned. If you desert in battle, you'll be hanged. If you fight with another crew member aboard ship, you'll be whipped. But you also know that you have a vote in all major decisions. You know you'll get your fair share of any plunder.
You know that if you're injured, you'll be compensated. You know that the captain can't just arbitrarily flog you for looking at him wrong. Compared to life on a merchant vessel or in the Navy, it's not a bad deal. Dangerous? Absolutely. But fair. And for men who'd spent years being abused and exploited by legitimate captains, fairness was worth risking their lives for.
The pirate code wasn't perfect. It was created by imperfect men living in violent times. But it represented something important, an attempt to create order and justice in a lawless world. These weren't just random criminals. They were organized, structured, democratic criminals. And their code, their Articles of Agreement, were some of the most progressive documents of their era. They predated the American and French revolutions by decades. They included concepts like voting rights, checks and balances on power, and compensation for workers. If you squint, you can see the seeds of modern democracy in those rum-stained pieces of parchment nailed to a pirate captain's door. Of course, most pirates didn't think of themselves as revolutionaries or pioneers of democracy. They just wanted to survive, prosper, and maybe have some fun along the way. But the system they created, out of necessity and practicality, ended up being far ahead of its time. So when you picture pirates now, don't just think of drunken thieves with eye patches and parrots. Think of them as men who, in their own rough way, understood something important. That people work better together when they're treated fairly. That power should be balanced and checked. That everyone deserves a voice and a fair share. The pirate code wasn't just rules. It was a social contract. It was a declaration that even outlaws could have principles. And those principles, brutal and practical as they were, created some of the most effective and long-lasting pirate crews in history. As you settle deeper into this journey, imagine yourself back on that dock in Port Royal. The sun has fully set now. The Caribbean is dark except for moonlight on the waves. In the tavern behind you, the men have finished drawing up their articles. One by one, they're stepping forward to sign. Each man knows what he's agreeing to. Each man knows the risks and the rewards. Each man is becoming part of something bigger than himself. And somewhere out on that moonlit sea, a pirate ship waits. Its crew united by a code. Its future uncertain. Its story about to begin. Now, let's dive deeper into the specific rules that governed these floating democracies. Let's look at the actual articles that pirates swore to uphold, starting with the most famous of them all. Let your mind settle. Picture yourself aboard Robert's flagship, the Royal Fortune, in early 1722. You're somewhere off the coast of West Africa. The ship rocks gently on Atlantic swells. Around you, the crew goes about their tasks. Some are mending sails, others cleaning weapons. The smell of tar and salt water fills your nostrils. And posted on the captain's cabin door, you can see the articles, the code, the rules that govern every aspect of life aboard this vessel. Let's read them together. Article 1 of Robert's Code began with the most fundamental principle. Every man has a vote in affairs of moment, has equal title to the fresh provisions or strong liquors at any time seized, and may use them at pleasure, unless a scarcity makes it necessary, for the good of all, to vote a retrenchment. Read that again, slowly. Every man has a vote. Not just some men, not just the educated or the wealthy,
or the noble-born. Every single man on the ship had an equal say in important matters. This was the early 1700s, remember. Most nations were still ruled by absolute monarchs. The British Parliament existed, but only a tiny fraction of men could vote, and women couldn't vote at all. Democracy as we know it wouldn't emerge for another century. Yet here, on a pirate ship, every man had a vote. What counted as affairs of moment? Big decisions. Where to sail next, whether to attack a particular ship, how to divide unusual plunder, whether to accept new members into the crew. These weren't decisions made by the captain alone. They were put to a vote, and your vote counted just as much as the captain's.
The article also guaranteed equal access to fresh provisions and strong liquors. When you captured a ship carrying food and rum, you didn't have to wait for officers to eat first. You had equal title to it. You could help yourself. The only exception was if supplies were running low, and then the crew would vote on rationing. Even rationing was democratic. Think about what this meant in practical terms. You're a common sailor on a Royal Navy ship. You might go hungry while watching officers feast. But on a pirate ship, everyone ate the same food. The captain didn't have a private stock of delicacies while you chewed weevil-infested hardtack. Whatever was available, you all shared equally. Article 2 dealt with prize money and clothing. Every man to be called fairly in turn, by list, on board of prizes, because, over and above their proper share, they were on these occasions allowed a shift of clothes. But if they defrauded the company to the value of $1 in plate, jewels, or money, marooning was the punishment. When you captured a ship, there was an order for who got to board it first. This was important because the first men aboard got first pick of extra clothes and personal items beyond the official share of treasure. But it was done fairly, by list, taking turns. You couldn't push your way to the front. Everyone got their chance. And notice the punishment for theft: marooning. If you stole even $1's worth of treasure from the common pot, you'd be left on a deserted island to die. The pirates took this seriously. The whole system depended on trust. If men started pocketing jewels and coins without declaring them, the fair distribution system would collapse. Nobody would trust anyone. The crew would tear itself apart with suspicion. So the punishment was severe. Marooning wasn't a quick death. It was slow, agonizing. We'll discuss it more later, but understand that it was one of the worst fates imaginable. And it was the penalty for breaking trust with your crew. Article 3 addressed everyone's favorite topic: alcohol. If any time we shall meet with a prudent woman, that man that offers to meddle with her without her consent shall suffer present death. Wait, that's not about alcohol. That's the anti-rape clause we mentioned earlier. Actually, that was Article 9. I'm jumping around a bit. Let me get back to the proper order. Article 3 was actually about gambling and keeping your weapons ready. But it's more interesting to talk about the bigger themes. So let's talk about the captain and quartermaster relationship, because this was the heart of the pirate democratic system. On a traditional ship, the captain was God. His word was absolute law. He lived in the best cabin, ate the best food, and could have you flogged or even executed for disobedience. He didn't need anyone's permission. He didn't answer to anyone except possibly the ship's owner, who was usually thousands of miles away. On a pirate ship, things were different. The captain had power, yes, but it was limited and balanced. He commanded during battle. When you were bearing down on a merchant ship with all guns ready,
The captain gave orders, and everyone obeyed instantly. No time for debate when cannonballs are flying. In those moments, the captain's authority was absolute. But outside of combat, the captain was just another crew member with maybe a bit more say. He ate the same food, slept in only a slightly better cabin, and most importantly, he had to contend with the quartermaster. The quartermaster was elected, just like the captain, but his role was completely different. While the captain handled warfare and navigation, the quartermaster handled everything else. He distributed provisions. He settled disputes. He maintained discipline. He was, as one contemporary observer noted, a humble imitation of the Roman tribune of the people. He speaks for and looks after the interest of the crew.
The quartermaster was the crew's representative. If you had a complaint about the captain, you took it to the quartermaster. If you thought the captain was abusing his authority, the quartermaster could call a vote to remove him. If two crew members had a quarrel, the quartermaster mediated. If someone was injured and needed their compensation, the quartermaster made sure they got every piece of eight they were owed. This dual executive system was brilliant. It prevented any one man from having too much power. The captain couldn't become a tyrant because the quartermaster would check him. The quartermaster couldn't become too controlling because the captain had authority in battle. And both of them had to keep the crew happy, or they'd be voted out. Let me tell you a story about how this system worked in practice. Captain Charles Vane was a pirate operating in the Caribbean around 1718. He was reasonably successful, capturing several ships. But then he made a mistake. He refused to attack a French man-of-war, a powerful naval vessel. Now, this might have been sensible. A man-of-war was dangerous. But Vane's crew wanted to try it anyway. They believed the potential prize was worth the risk. Vane disagreed and sailed away. This violated the basic principle of pirate democracy. The crew decides. The crew didn't agree with the captain's decision. So what happened? They held a vote. They deposed Vane as captain. They elected a new captain named John Rackham, better known as Calico Jack. And Vane? They gave him a small ship and some supplies, and told him to go find his own crew. This wasn't even considered particularly dramatic. It was just how the system worked. Captain makes a decision the crew doesn't like? Vote him out. Find someone better. No violence necessary. No mutiny in the bloody sense. Just democracy in action. Compare this to what happened on legitimate vessels. If a Royal Navy captain made a bad decision, the crew had no recourse. They couldn't vote. They couldn't complain. Their only options were to obey or to commit actual mutiny, which meant violence, which meant everyone would hang if they were caught. On a pirate ship, you could remove a bad captain with a show of hands. The quartermaster was particularly important in maintaining this balance. Bartholomew Roberts' quartermaster during part of his career was a man named Thomas Anstis. Anstis had been a sailor in the merchant service before turning pirate. He understood how traditional ships worked, with their rigid hierarchies and absolute captain's authority. And he understood how much better the pirate system was for the common crew. Anstis later became a captain himself after Roberts and he parted ways. And when he drew up his own articles, they closely followed Roberts' model. He'd seen how well the system worked. Why change it? Let's continue through Roberts' articles. Article 4. No man to talk of breaking up their way of living till each had shared £1,000. If, in order to this,
any man should lose a limb or become a cripple in their service, he was to have $800 out of the public stock, and for lesser hurts, proportionately.
This is fascinating for several reasons. First, it set a goal. You were agreeing to stay with the crew until everyone had accumulated £1,000. That was a fortune for a common sailor. A merchant seaman might earn £3 a month if he was lucky. £1,000 was years and years of wages. It was enough to retire on, to buy a farm, to set yourself up for life. But the article acknowledged that you might not make it to that goal. You might lose a limb. You might become a cripple. And if that happened, you'd receive $800 immediately. Not £1,000, but still a substantial sum, enough to live on. For lesser hurts, proportionately. This meant there was a whole schedule of compensation. We mentioned some of it earlier. Right arm, 600 pieces of 8. Left arm, 500. Right leg, 500. Left leg, 400. An eye, 100. A finger, about the same as an eye. Why this specific scale? Experience. Pirates had been losing limbs for decades. They knew from hard experience how debilitating each injury was. Losing your right arm as a right-handed man meant you couldn't fight effectively anymore, couldn't handle most shipboard tasks. It was more crippling than losing your left arm, so it merited more compensation. This wasn't some abstract idea of workers' compensation. This was practical recognition that the work was dangerous and men deserved to be taken care of if they got hurt doing it. Compare this to merchant ships or the Navy, where an injured sailor might be paid off with a pittance or nothing at all. The Pirate Code guaranteed it in writing. Every man who signed the articles knew exactly what he'd receive if he was injured. There was no ambiguity, no room for the captain to cheat you. It was spelled out clearly, and the whole crew enforced it. If a captain tried to shortchange an injured man, the quartermaster would step in. The crew would vote to make it right, because they all knew that next time it might be them missing an arm. Article 5 dealt with the division of prize money in more detail. The captain and quartermaster to receive 2 shares of a prize. The master, boatswain, and gunner 1 share and a half, and other officers 1 1/4. This was the standard pirate pay scale. The captain got double what a common crewman received. Not 10 times more, not 50 times more, double. The quartermaster, who had almost as much responsibility, also got 2 shares. Other officers got slightly more than regular crew, usually 1 1/4 to 1 1/2 shares. This was remarkably flat compared to legitimate vessels. On a Royal Navy ship, a captain might earn 30 to 40 times what an ordinary seaman earned. On a merchant ship, the ratio could be anywhere from 5 to 1 up to 20 to 1 or more, depending on the voyage and the cargo. But on a pirate ship, 2 to 1 max. Everyone agreed this was fair. The captain took the most risk. He was the one who'd hang first if they were captured. He made the hardest decisions. He deserved to be paid more. But not that much more. Not so much that the common crew felt like they were being exploited. Article 6 addressed something we've touched on before. No boy or woman to be allowed amongst them. If any man were to be found seducing any of the latter sex, and carried her to sea, disguised, he was to suffer death. The punishment for bringing a woman aboard was death. Immediate execution. Why so harsh? The pirates believed women would cause problems.
jealousy, fighting, distraction. Whether this belief was accurate is debatable. We know that some women successfully disguised themselves as men and went to sea, some even as pirates. Anne Bonny and Mary Read are the most famous examples, though there were others. But the rule was clear. If you were caught smuggling a woman aboard, you died. And the woman? The article doesn't specify her fate. It just says the man who brought her would die. The woman's punishment was left to the whim of the crew, which rarely boded well for her.
Yet, as we mentioned, these same articles that forbade women aboard also protected women the pirates encountered. Article 9 stated that any man who raped a prudent woman would suffer present death, immediate execution, no trial, no debate. You rape a woman, you die. This seems contradictory to modern eyes. You can't bring women aboard, but you can't rape captive women either. The logic was purely practical. Bringing women aboard caused internal problems. Raping captives caused external problems. It made future victims fight harder instead of surrendering. It ruined your reputation. And reputation mattered in piracy. If word got out that a particular pirate crew was known for raping and torturing captives, what would happen? Every merchant ship they approached would fight to the death. No one would surrender peacefully. This meant more pirate casualties, more damage to the pirate ship, lower profits. It was bad for business. So the rule against rape wasn't about morality or respect for women. It was about maintaining the crew's effectiveness and reputation. Pragmatic, not principled. But the result was the same. Rape was forbidden under penalty of death. Article 7. To desert the ship or their quarters in battle was punished with death or marooning. Cowardice in battle would not be tolerated. If you ran away when the fighting started, if you hid below decks instead of manning your station, you'd be executed or marooned. This was non-negotiable. The survival of the entire crew depended on everyone doing their job in battle. One coward could get everyone killed. Think about naval combat in the age of sail. Cannonballs are smashing through the hull. Splinters the size of daggers are flying everywhere. Men are screaming. Blood is everywhere. It's chaos, noise, terror. Every instinct tells you to hide, to run, to get below decks away from the death. But you have to stay at your post. You have to keep loading the cannon, or handling the sails, or firing your musket. Because if you don't, if everyone gives in to fear, the ship will be captured or destroyed. The penalty for desertion had to be severe enough to overcome that natural fear. Death or marooning. Those were the only options. And the crew would enforce it. After the battle, if you deserted, your shipmates would know. They'd hold you accountable, because your cowardice had put their lives at risk. Article 8. No striking one another on board, but every man's quarrels to be ended on shore, at sword and pistol. We discussed this before, but it bears repeating. No fighting aboard ship. If you had a problem with another crew member, you took it ashore and settled it properly, under the quartermaster's supervision. Back to back, walk a certain number of paces, turn, and fire pistols. If both men survived, they'd draw swords and fight until one yielded or died. This wasn't about preventing violence. Pirates were violent men. It was about channeling that violence in a way that didn't endanger the ship or disrupt the crew's cohesion. A fair duel on shore was acceptable. A brawl on deck, while barrels of gunpowder sat nearby, was not. And the quartermaster would make sure the duel was fair. He'd inspect the weapons, measure out the paces, give the command to fire. This way, nobody could claim they were ambushed or cheated. If you died in a properly conducted duel, well, that was unfortunate, but fair. If you were murdered in a back-alley fight, that would be different. That would be against the code. Article 9 we've covered. Death for rape. Article 10 was about lights and smoking. The lights and candles to be put out at 8 o'clock at night. If any of the crew, after that hour, still remained inclined for drinking, they were to do it on the open deck. 8 o'clock bedtime. This sounds quaint, maybe even childish, but it was deadly serious. Fire was the greatest danger aboard a wooden ship. One candle knocked over, one spark from a pipe, and the whole vessel could go up in flames. And if fire broke out below decks, where the gunpowder was stored, everyone would die in the explosion. So lights out at 8. If you wanted to keep drinking after that, fine. Do it on deck, where there's no danger of starting a fire below. This wasn't about controlling when men slept. It was about preventing disaster. Article 11. To keep their piece, pistols, and cutlass clean and fit for service. Your weapons had to be maintained and ready. This seems obvious, but it needed to be spelled out. A musket that misfires in battle because you didn't clean it properly could get men killed. A rusty cutlass that breaks when you're boarding an enemy ship could get you killed. Your weapons weren't just your personal property. They were part of the ship's arsenal. They needed to be ready at all times. Neglecting this duty could result in losing your share of the prize money. The article didn't specify death or marooning for this offense, but it did say you'd suffer such other punishment as the captain and the company shall think fit. Maybe a whipping, maybe a reduction in shares, depended on how serious the neglect was and how angry the crew was about it. And if you drift off here, nothing important will be missed. These articles, these rules, weren't just abstract principles. They governed every aspect of daily life aboard a pirate ship. They determined how you ate, how you slept, how you worked, how you fought, how you settled disputes, how you shared treasure. They were comprehensive, detailed, and enforced. And they worked. Bartholomew Roberts used these articles to capture over 400 ships in 3 years. His crew stayed mostly loyal, mostly unified. There were no major mutinies, no massive internal conflicts. Men knew the rules. They'd agreed to them. They followed them. When Roberts was finally killed in battle with the Royal Navy in February 1722, his crew tried to continue without him. They elected a new captain. But shortly after, they were captured. At the trial, over 50 men were hanged for piracy. The articles they'd signed were used as evidence against them. Having your name on those documents proved you'd voluntarily joined the pirate crew. It was a death sentence. This is why most pirate captains, when they knew capture was imminent, would burn or throw overboard their articles. Destroy the evidence. Give your men a chance to claim they were forced into piracy, that they never signed anything. It didn't always work, but it gave them a slim hope. Robert's articles weren't unique. Other pirates had similar codes. But his were among the most detailed and comprehensive that survived. They give us a window into how these floating democracies actually functioned. And they show us that pirates weren't just chaotic criminals. They were organized, structured, with clear rules and consequences. Think about what it meant to sign these articles. You were agreeing to risk your life for the promise of wealth. You were agreeing to follow rules that could get you killed if you broke them. But you were also gaining something: a voice, a vote, a guarantee that you'd be treated fairly, that you'd get your share, that you'd be compensated if injured. For men who'd spent years being abused on legitimate ships, this was a fair trade. The pirate code represented something radical for its time, not because pirates were enlightened or progressive, but because they'd figured out that treating men fairly made them more effective. A crew that felt cheated would mutiny. A crew that was happy would fight harder, work smarter, stick together. It was pure pragmatism. But the result was a system that, in many ways, was more democratic and fair than anything else available to working-class sailors in the early 1700s. Voting rights, checks and balances on power, guaranteed compensation for injuries, transparent and equal distribution of wealth. These concepts wouldn't become mainstream for another century or more. But pirates were already living them. As you continue this journey, picture that ship again, the Royal Fortune. Bartholomew Roberts at the helm, his articles posted for all to see. The crew going about their tasks, each man knowing his role, his rights, his responsibilities. The quartermaster keeping watch, making sure everyone is treated fairly. The captain commanding in battle, but answering to the crew in peace. It's almost romantic, until you remember that these were still criminals. They robbed, they killed, they caused terror and destruction. The pirate code made them more effective pirates, but it didn't make them good people. It just made them organized. Now, let's explore the heart of why men became pirates in the first place. Let's look at the treasure, the compensation, and the economics that made all of this worth the risk. Picture yourself aboard a pirate vessel in the Caribbean, 1721. You've just taken a Spanish merchantman. She was carrying silver from the mines of Peru, along with cocoa, sugar, and fine cloth. The battle wasn't too fierce. The merchant crew saw your black flag, your guns, and surrendered without much fight. Smart of them. Now comes the interesting part, dividing the spoils. The captured ship is brought alongside. The Spanish crew is locked below decks, while your crew swarms aboard. The quartermaster is there, keeping order, making sure everything is done properly. You watch as men open cargo holds and start bringing up chests. Silver coins glinting in the sunlight, rolls of expensive silk, barrels of sugar and cocoa. This is why you're here. This is what makes all the danger worthwhile. But how will it all be divided? This is where the pirate code becomes absolutely crucial. Let's talk about treasure distribution in detail, because this was the foundation of pirate economics. The principle was simple: no prey, no pay. If you didn't capture anything, nobody earned anything. There was no base salary, no guaranteed wage. You succeeded together or failed together. This aligned everyone's interests perfectly. When a prize was captured, the first step was assessment. The quartermaster would inventory everything. Every coin counted, every bolt of cloth measured, every cask of sugar weighed. This wasn't approximate.
It was exact. Because the entire system depended on transparency and trust. While this inventory was happening, the crew couldn't just help themselves. Everything went into the common pot first. Then, once the full value was known, it would be distributed according to the articles. Remember, stealing from the common pot was punishable by marooning. Even $1's worth. The pirates took this deadly seriously. Let's say your ship just captured 10,000 pieces of 8 in silver, plus goods worth another 5,000. That's 15,000 pieces of 8 total. Now, how many shares are there? Well, it depends on the size of the crew. Let's say you have 100 men. The captain gets 2 shares. The quartermaster gets 1.5 or 2 shares. Other officers get 1.25 shares each. Let's say you have 5 officers besides the captain and quartermaster, and the remaining 93 men get 1 share each. So your total shares are 2 for captain, 2 for quartermaster, 6.25 for 5 officers at 1.25 shares each, and 93 for the common crew. That's 103.25 shares total. Divide 15,000 by 103.25, and each share is worth about 145 pieces of 8. A common crewman gets 145 pieces of 8. The captain gets 290. The officers get about 181 each. The quartermaster gets 290. Now, 145 pieces of 8 was serious money. A common sailor on a merchant ship might earn 25 shillings a month, maybe 15 pounds a year, if he was lucky. A piece of 8 was worth about 4 shillings. So 145 pieces of 8 equals 580 shillings, or 29 pounds. That's almost 2 years' wages from a single capture. And if you captured multiple ships? If you had a good year like Black Bart Roberts did, you could accumulate hundreds or even thousands of pounds. Enough to retire on. Enough to buy land, start a business, set yourself up for life. If you lived that long. The distribution happened immediately, or as soon as the ship made port. There was no waiting, no promises of payment later. The quartermaster would count out your coins right there, or if the treasure was too valuable to carry, it would be sold at the next port, and the money distributed then. But there was no ambiguity, no delay. You got your share. This was radically different from merchant ships. On a merchant vessel, you might not get paid until the voyage ended, which could be months or years. And even then, the captain or ship owner might cheat you, claiming expenses ate up all the profits. You had no recourse. You just had to accept whatever they gave you. But on a pirate ship, the division was public, transparent, done right there in front of everyone. You could count your coins yourself. You could watch the quartermaster count out everyone else's shares. If someone tried to cheat, the whole crew would know, and they'd deal with it according to the articles. This transparency created trust, and trust made the system work. Men were willing to risk their lives because they knew they'd get their fair share. There was no wealthy owner taking most of the profits. There was no captain pocketing extra treasure. Everything was split according to the rules everyone had agreed to. Now, let's talk about the injury compensation system in more detail. This was one of the most progressive aspects of the pirate code. Remember, we're talking about the early 1700s.
There were no workers' compensation laws, no disability insurance, no government safety nets. If you got hurt at work, tough luck. But pirates took care of their own. The articles spelled out exactly what you'd receive for specific injuries. And these weren't trivial amounts. Losing a right arm meant 600 pieces of 8. That's over 2,400 shillings, or 120 pounds. That's 8 years of wages for a merchant sailor. Enough to live on for quite a while if you were frugal.
Why did pirates do this?
Partly because it was fair. If a man lost his livelihood fighting for the crew should support him. But also because it was practical. If injured pirates were just abandoned, healthy pirates would be less willing to fight. They'd hold back in battle, trying to avoid injury. This would make the crew less effective. But if you knew that losing a limb meant immediate, substantial compensation, you'd fight harder. You'd take more risks. Because you knew that even if the worst happened, you and your family wouldn't starve. The compensation system was insurance, bought with the crew's collective plunder. The scale of compensation reflected the reality of injuries. Losing your right arm as a right-handed man was more debilitating than losing your left, so it paid more. Losing a leg was serious, but you could still work on a ship in some capacity. Losing both legs or both arms? That wasn't explicitly covered in most codes, probably because surviving such injuries was rare. Men usually died from blood loss or infection. Losing an eye was serious, but not as crippling as losing a limb. You could still fight, still work. So the compensation was less, 100 pieces of 8. Still a significant sum, but not as much as a limb. Losing a finger? Same as an eye. You could still function mostly normally with 9 fingers instead of 10. The compensation was paid immediately, or as soon as the ship had enough money. It came from the common pot before the regular distribution of shares. This meant that everyone's share would be slightly smaller to pay for the injured man's compensation. But nobody objected. They all knew it could be them next time. They all benefited from the insurance system. Some articles specified even more detailed compensation. Henry Morgan's Buccaneer Code, which predated the Golden Age pirates but influenced them, had this schedule. Right arm, 600 pieces of 8, or 6 slaves. Left arm, 500 pieces of 8, or 5 slaves. Right leg, 500 pieces of 8, or 5 slaves. Left leg, 400 pieces of 8, or 4 slaves. An eye, 100 pieces of 8, or 1 slave. A finger of the hand, the same as for an eye. Notice the option to receive slaves instead of money? This was the 1600s and early 1700s, and slavery was unfortunately legal and common. A slave could work for you, earn money, provide for you if you were disabled. This wasn't about modern morality. It was about providing for injured men in whatever way worked in that era. By the Golden Age of Piracy, most codes didn't mention slaves explicitly, just pieces of 8. But the principle was the same. Specific injuries had specific compensation, guaranteed, no questions asked. Now, what happened if you were injured, but not permanently? What if you took a musket ball to the leg and recovered, or got slashed with a cutlass but healed? The articles usually said, for lesser hurts, proportionately. This meant the captain and quartermaster, possibly with input from the crew, would decide fair compensation. Maybe a few pieces of 8, maybe some extra rum, maybe time to recover without having to work. It was flexible, but guided by the principle of fairness.
The whole compensation system was backed by the ship's surgeon, if there was one. Many pirate ships had a surgeon, though he was often just someone with basic medical knowledge rather than a trained doctor. The surgeon's job was to treat injuries and illnesses, and crucially, to verify injuries for compensation purposes.
If you claimed you lost a finger, the surgeon would confirm it. This prevented fraud. You couldn't claim compensation for an injury you didn't actually have. The surgeon was usually paid more than ordinary crew, often getting 1 1/4 shares or more. This was because skilled medical people were rare and valuable. Pirates would sometimes force captured surgeons to join their crew, not giving them a choice. Let me tell you about a surgeon named John Howell. He was captured by pirates in 1722 off the coast of Newfoundland. The pirates needed a surgeon. Howell refused to sign their articles. He didn't want to be a pirate. But they forced him to work anyway, treating injured crew members. He wasn't given a share of the plunder since he hadn't signed the articles. But he also wasn't free to leave. He was essentially a slave, though they probably called him something else. Eventually, the pirate ship was captured by the Royal Navy. Howell was tried along with the pirates. He argued that he'd been forced, that he'd never signed the articles, that he'd tried to escape. The court believed him and acquitted him. This was rare. Most forced men still hanged because they couldn't prove they'd been coerced. But Howell was lucky, and his status as a non-signer helped save his life. Now, let's turn to one of the most controversial aspects of the pirate code, the rules about women. Most pirate articles included some version of this rule: no women allowed aboard. The punishment for bringing a woman onto the ship was usually death. Bartholomew Roberts' article was typical. No boy or woman to be allowed amongst them. If any man were to be found seducing any of the latter sex and carried her to sea, disguised, he was to suffer death. Why this rule? Several reasons. First, superstition. Sailors had long believed that women aboard brought bad luck. The ship itself was female, see? She had a woman's name. She was referred to as she. And if you brought another woman aboard, the ship would get jealous. She'd rebel, wouldn't sail properly, would bring disaster. This sounds absurd to us now, but sailors took it seriously. There are stories of crews throwing female passengers overboard during storms, believing this would calm the angry sea. In one horrific incident in the Middle Ages, a crew threw more than 60 women overboard when they hit rough weather. This was murder, but they believed they were saving the ship. Second, practical concerns. A ship was a cramped space with dozens or hundreds of men. Sexual tension was already an issue. Adding women to the mix would lead to fighting, jealousy, competition. Men would compete for the woman's attention. This would fracture the crew's unity. And unity was essential for survival. Third, distraction. Men needed to focus on their tasks. Sailing a ship was dangerous work that required constant attention. Navigation, handling sails, maintaining rigging, standing watch. If men were distracted by romantic or sexual interest, they'd make mistakes. Mistakes at sea killed people. So the rule was, no women aboard. Keep it simple. Avoid problems. But what about women who wanted to go to sea? Some did disguise themselves as men. The most famous pirate women, Anne Bonny and Mary Read, both dressed as men. Anne Bonny was unusual in that she eventually stopped pretending, wearing whatever she wanted.
But Mary Read maintained her male disguise until she was captured. Disguising yourself as a man wasn't easy. You had to bind your breasts flat. You had to cut your hair or tie it back in a man's style, tarred like other sailors wore. You had to wear men's clothes, which was illegal for women in many places. You had to adopt masculine mannerisms, swagger, curse, fight, drink like the men did. If you acted too feminine, you'd be discovered. And you had to deal with bodily functions without privacy. Ships didn't have bathrooms in the modern sense. There was the head, a hole at the front of the ship where you'd relieve yourself over the water. No stalls, no privacy. You'd have to find ways to manage this without being seen. Some women managed it. Historical records mention several female sailors who served for years without being discovered. Usually they were only found out when injured or killed, and someone had to undress them. Or sometimes in prison after capture. The conditions were terrible, and maintaining a disguise became impossible. But the pirate code made it clear, if you were caught smuggling a woman aboard, even disguised, you'd be executed. The woman's fate wasn't usually specified. Maybe she'd be put ashore at the next port. Maybe worse. It depended on the crew's mood and the captain's character. Yet the same codes that forbade women aboard also protected women the pirates encountered during their raids. This is the paradox we mentioned before. You couldn't bring women on your ship, but you couldn't rape the women you captured either. The punishment for rape was also death. Why? Reputation and practicality. If your crew was known for raping captives, future victims would fight to the death rather than surrender. This meant more casualties, more damage to your ship, less profit. It was bad business. Some pirates violated this rule, of course. Edward Lowe, a particularly vicious pirate captain, was notorious for torturing captives. His men probably committed sexual violence, though records are unclear. Lowe was feared and hated, even by other pirates. Eventually, his own crew mutinied against him because they were tired of his cruelty. They set him adrift in a small boat and left him to die. So the rule against rape was enforced, at least on well-run pirate ships. Not because pirates were enlightened or feminist, but because sexual violence was bad for discipline and bad for business. John Phillips, who we mentioned earlier, added an explicit anti-rape clause to his articles after witnessing a horrific gang rape and murder committed by his previous captain's crew. Phillips had served under Thomas Anstis, and Anstis's crew had captured a ship with female passengers. The pirates gang raped these women and then murdered them. Phillips was apparently disgusted by this. When he became a captain himself and drew up his own articles, he included this: "If at any time we meet with a prudent woman, that man that offers to meddle with her without her consent shall suffer present death." Present death means immediate execution. No trial, no debate. You rape someone, you die right there. Phillips wasn't protecting women out of the goodness of his heart. He'd seen how sexual violence destabilized a crew, created enemies, made victims fight harder. It was a practical rule. But the result was the same. His code forbade rape under penalty of death. The phrase prudent woman is interesting. What made a woman prudent versus imprudent? The language probably meant a respectable woman, as opposed to a prostitute. This reflects the sexist morality of the time. But even this limited protection was more than many women could expect from legitimate sailors or soldiers. Royal Navy crews and merchant sailors committed sexual violence too. There were fewer rules protecting victims. A captain might punish his men for raping captives, or he might not. It depended on his personal ethics and priorities. But there was no universal code, no automatic death penalty. The pirates, ironically, had more explicit rules protecting women from sexual assault than most legitimate forces did. And if you drift off here, that's perfectly fine. Let the information wash over you like waves.
The Pirate Code's rules about women reveal the complexity of these men. They weren't heroes or freedom fighters. They were criminals operating in a brutal era. But they also had a kind of internal logic, a system of rules that made sense within their context. No women aboard kept the crew unified and focused. Death for rape kept the operation running smoothly and maintained their fearsome but not monstrous reputation. Modern pirates, the ones operating off Somalia or in the Strait of Malacca, don't have these elaborate codes. They're more simple criminals, motivated purely by ransom and profit. But Golden Age pirates? They had structure, rules, a whole system of governance. And that system, with all its contradictions and complexities, was part of what made them so successful. The treasure distribution system, the injury compensation, the rules about women. These weren't separate elements. They all tied together into a comprehensive code that governed every aspect of pirate life. Break one rule, and you threatened the whole system. Follow the rules, and you and your crewmates could thrive, at least until the Royal Navy caught up with you. As you drift deeper into this story, imagine yourself as that pirate again, standing on deck after a successful raid. Your pockets are heavy with silver coins, your share of the prize. You've been lucky so far, no serious injuries. You know the rules. You know what you'd get if you were hurt. You know the boundaries. And within those boundaries, you have more freedom and fairness than you ever had on a legitimate ship. The treasure distribution system, the injury compensation, the rules about women. These weren't separate elements. They all tied together into a comprehensive code that governed every aspect of pirate life. Break one rule, and you threaten the whole system. Follow the rules, and you and your crewmates could thrive, at least until the Royal Navy caught up with you. But what was it actually like to live under these rules, day by day? Let's explore the mundane realities of pirate life. The food, the drink, the endless watches, and the back-breaking work that kept these ships sailing. Picture yourself waking up aboard a pirate ship. It's just before dawn. You're in a hammock, swaying gently with the motion of the waves. Around you, other men are stirring. The air is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, tar, and salt water. Someone nearby is coughing, a deep, wet sound. Above you, you can hear footsteps on the deck. The watch is changing. The pirate code governed even this simple moment. Your ship operated on a watch system, usually 3 watches. This meant the crew was divided into 3 groups. At any given time, 2 watches were on duty and 1 was resting. You'd work 4 hours, then rest 4 hours, then work another 4. Around the clock, this pattern continued. This system was crucial. A sailing ship needed constant attention. Sails had to be adjusted as the wind changed. The helm had to be manned. Someone had to keep watch for other ships, for land, for storms. If everyone slept at the same time, the ship would drift off course or run into trouble.
so the watches rotated, ensuring the ship was always manned. The pirate code didn't usually spell out the watch system in detail, because it was so fundamental to seafaring that everyone understood it. But the code did specify consequences for neglecting your duties. If you fell asleep on watch or failed to keep your station, you might lose your share of the next prize, or face whipping, depending on how serious the failure was. You roll out of your hammock, your joints stiff. Maybe you're 30 years old, but you feel 50. Life at sea ages you fast. You make your way to the head, that hole at the front of the ship, and relieve yourself over the water. Then it's time for breakfast.
What do pirates eat? This is one of the most asked questions, and the answer is not much, and nothing good. Let's talk about the pirate diet, because food was a constant concern governed by the Articles. Remember, the code specified that every man had equal access to provisions. The captain didn't eat better than you. Everyone shared the same supplies. The staple of every pirate diet was hardtack. You've probably heard of it. Ship's biscuit. It was a dense, hard cracker made from flour, water, and a tiny bit of salt. Baked until it was nearly indestructible. The goal was longevity, not taste. Hardtack could last for months or even years if kept dry. But here's the thing about hardtack. It was almost inedible in its natural state. Hard as a rock. You could break your teeth trying to bite into it. So pirates would soften it by dipping it in water or rum, or whatever liquid was available. Or they'd crumble it and mix it into a porridge or stew. And after a few weeks at sea, the hardtack would develop little inhabitants, weevils, small beetles that infested the biscuits. You'd tap your hardtack on the table before eating it, trying to knock out the weevils. If you were sailing at night and didn't want to see how many weevils were in your food, you'd just eat in the dark, out of sight, out of mind. The weevils added protein, some sailors joked grimly. Besides hardtack, you'd have salt pork or salt beef. Meat preserved in barrels of brine. The salt content was so high it would make your mouth pucker. The meat was tough, dried out, often nearly black. Some sailors described it as being like chewing leather or wood. After months in the barrel, it became almost inedible. But it wouldn't rot, and that's what mattered. You'd have to soak the salt meat in water to make it edible, boiling it for hours to soften it. Even then, it was tough and barely palatable. Some sailors carved buttons and belt buckles from salt beef. That's how hard it was. This wasn't a joke. The meat was genuinely that rigid. If you were lucky, you'd have some dried peas or beans to go with your meat. These would be made into a soup or stew, what they called lobscouse or burgoo. Boil everything together for hours, add whatever spices you had, hope for the best. Sometimes there'd be onions or garlic if you'd recently taken a prize that carried them. Maybe some vinegar to cut the salt. But fresh vegetables were rare and didn't keep long. The only time you'd eat well was right after capturing a ship or visiting a port. Then you might have fresh meat, maybe a chicken or goat that you'd kept alive on deck for eggs or milk until you needed to butcher it. Fresh fish if someone had time to trail a line. Fresh fruit if you were in the Caribbean and could raid plantations. But these moments of plenty were brief. Most of the time you ate hardtack and salt meat and tried not to think about it too much. Now, let's talk about drink. Water aboard a ship went bad quickly. Stored in wooden casks, it would develop algae and scum within weeks. It would taste foul, smell worse. Drinking it might make you sick. So pirates, like all sailors, preferred alcohol. Beer and ale were popular, but they didn't keep as well as harder spirits. Rum was the drink of choice in the Caribbean. Rum was made from sugarcane and molasses, produced on plantations throughout the West Indies. It was cheap, readily available, and had a long shelf life. It also got you drunk efficiently, which was important for men living hard, dangerous lives. Pirates drank a lot of rum. Not always straight, though. Often it was mixed with water, lime juice, and sometimes sugar to make grog. This served multiple purposes. The lime juice prevented scurvy, a disease caused by lack of vitamin C that made your gums bleed and your teeth fall out. The water diluted the alcohol so you wouldn't be completely drunk all the time. And the mixture was more palatable than straight rum or foul water alone. The pirate code often regulated drinking. Robert's articles said lights had to be out by 8 o'clock. If you wanted to keep drinking after that, you did it on deck where you wouldn't accidentally start a fire. Some codes limited how much alcohol crew members could have per day to prevent constant drunkenness, but enforcement varied. Some captains were strict, others less so. Stories of pirates being drunk all the time are exaggerated. Yes, they drank. Yes, they sometimes got roaring drunk in port and spent all their money on rum and prostitutes. But at sea, during a voyage, you needed to stay relatively sober. A drunk crew was a dead crew. You couldn't navigate, couldn't fight, couldn't handle the ship properly if everyone was intoxicated. So the code balanced freedom with necessity. You had access to alcohol, but there were rules about when and how much. Break those rules, and you'd face punishment. After breakfast, which might have been a piece of hardtack and a mug of watered rum, you'd report to your station. What you did depended on your role. If you were a common sailor, you'd be trimming sails, handling lines, swabbing the deck. If you were the carpenter, you'd be checking for leaks and making repairs. The sailmaker would be mending canvas. The gunner would be maintaining weapons. Life aboard a ship was constant work. Even when you weren't chasing prizes, there was always something to do. Sails wore out and needed repair. Ropes frayed and had to be spliced. The deck needed scrubbing to prevent rot. Every part of the ship required maintenance. And then there was gun practice. If you captured a ship with gunpowder to spare, which wasn't always, you'd practice with the cannons, loading, aiming, firing. This was essential. Naval combat was decided by who could fire faster and more accurately. A well-drilled gun crew could reload and fire a cannon in just a couple of minutes. A poorly trained crew might take 5 minutes or more. That difference could determine who won a battle. The pirate code required you to keep your weapons clean and ready. This wasn't just your personal musket and cutlass. This was the ship's entire arsenal. Cannons had to be cleaned after firing, or they'd rust. Gunpowder had to be kept dry. Muskets and pistols had to be maintained. Swords had to be sharp. Neglecting this could get people killed, so the code made it a serious offense. If you weren't on duty or working, what did you do? This is where life aboard a pirate ship differed from legitimate vessels. Pirates had more leisure time and fewer restrictions. They'd gamble, play cards or dice,
though some codes restricted gambling because it led to fights. They'd tell stories, sing songs, play instruments if anyone had one. Fiddles were common, as were simple flutes or pipes.
Music was important. Sea shanties weren't just entertainment. They were functional, helping coordinate work. When 20 men had to pull on a rope together, a shanty gave them rhythm. Heave, ho! Heave, ho! Everyone pulled on the same beat, making the work more efficient. And in the evenings, music provided entertainment and boosted morale. Some pirates had musicians who were given special treatment. Robert's articles stated, "The musicians shall have rest on the Sabbath day only, by right, on all other days, by favor only." This meant musicians had to play whenever asked, every day except Sunday. Sunday was their guaranteed day off. This shows how much pirates valued entertainment. They wanted music available constantly, even made it part of their official code. Besides music and gambling, what else? Storytelling. Men would share tales of previous voyages, of storms survived, of battles won. They'd boast about their exploits, probably exaggerating. They'd discuss their plans for when they had enough money to retire, where they'd go, what they'd do. Most would never make it that far, but the dream kept them going. And they drank. When you weren't on duty, when the work was done, you'd sit with your mates and drink rum and talk. This was how friendships formed, how the crew bonded. The pirate code regulated this somewhat, as we mentioned, but it also recognized that men needed to relax. Now let's talk about something crucial that happened periodically. Careening. This was one of the most vulnerable and labor-intensive tasks a pirate crew faced. Every few months, barnacles and seaweed would accumulate on the ship's hull. This growth slowed the ship down, made it less maneuverable. In a business where being able to catch merchant ships and outrun naval vessels was essential, speed mattered. So the ship had to be careened. This meant finding a secluded beach, usually on an uninhabited island. You'd run the ship up onto the sand at high tide. Then, as the tide went out, the ship would settle onto its side. The crew would then spend days scraping the hull clean, removing all the barnacles, seaweed, and other growth. You'd also repair any damage, replace rotted planks, seal leaks with tar and oakum. Careening was brutal work. Scraping barnacles in the hot tropical sun, breathing in tar fumes, bending and straining for hours. And the ship was completely vulnerable during this time. If a naval vessel appeared while your ship was beached, you were done. You couldn't escape. You'd have to fight on land at a major disadvantage, or surrender. The pirate code didn't specifically mandate careening schedules, because this was basic seamanship. But the code did require everyone to participate in the work. You couldn't just sit in the shade while your crewmates labored. Everyone had to help. And after careening, the crew was usually given extra rum rations and time to recover. Careening was also when some pirates would desert. They'd slip away into the jungle, taking their share of the treasure, hoping to make it to civilization somehow. The penalty for desertion was death or marooning, but some men took the risk. They'd had enough of pirate life, or they thought they'd accumulated enough money, or they were afraid of getting caught and hanged. Most men didn't desert, though. For all its hardships, pirate life under the code was often better than the alternatives. Better than being a merchant sailor, getting paid pittance and beaten by tyrannical captains. Better than being a laborer on a plantation. Better than being unemployed and starving in some port city. The pirate code guaranteed fairness, a share of the profits, compensation if injured. That was worth something. Let me tell you about one aspect of daily life that might surprise you. Cleanliness. Pirates weren't as filthy as popular culture suggests. Yes, they smelled. Everyone did in that era. Bathing wasn't common in general society. But pirates did try to keep their ship clean. The deck had to be scrubbed regularly or it would rot. Salt water and sand were used to scour the wood. Ropes and sails had to be kept clean and dry when possible. The hold had to be cleared of bilge water, that disgusting mixture of seawater, urine, and other fluids that collected at the bottom of the ship. Pumps would be manned to expel this water. If you let the bilge accumulate, the ship would start to stink unbearably, and disease would spread. Disease was a constant threat. In the close quarters of a ship, illness spread rapidly. If one man got dysentery or typhus, soon the whole crew might have it. The code didn't specify health regulations, but smart captains enforced basic hygiene. Sick men were isolated if possible. The surgeon would treat them, though his remedies were often useless or harmful. Bloodletting was a common treatment that probably killed more than it cured. And if you drift here, let sleep carry you gently away. The daily routine aboard a pirate ship followed the rhythm of the watches. Every 4 hours, a new watch would take over. The boatswain would blow his whistle, and men would change stations. If you were on night watch, you'd spend hours in darkness, listening to the creak of the ship, watching for the lights of other vessels, trying not to fall asleep, because that would get you punished. Night watches were particularly hard. Staying alert in the dark, with nothing but stars and the sound of water against the hull. Some men claimed to see things in the night. Ships that weren't there, lights in the distance that vanished when you looked directly at them. Phantoms, ghosts, sea monsters. Sailors were superstitious, and the night watch fed those superstitions. When your watch ended, you'd stumble back to your hammock and try to sleep, rocked by the waves. 4 hours later, you'd wake and do it again. This cycle continued day after day, week after week. It was exhausting, but it was life at sea. The pirate code didn't change this fundamental reality. It just ensured you were treated fairly while enduring it. Occasionally, there'd be a break in the routine. A sail sighted on the horizon. The crew would spring into action. Was it a potential prize? A naval warship? Another pirate? The lookout in the crow's nest would shout down descriptions. The captain would decide whether to chase or flee. If it was a potential prize, you'd alter course to intercept. Then came the excitement, the danger, the reason you were here. You'd run out the guns, load them, prepare to fight. If the target was a merchant ship and they saw your black flag and your guns, they might surrender immediately. Then you'd board them, take control, transfer their cargo to your ship. Maybe take their vessel too if it was better than yours. If they fought back, you'd exchange cannon fire. This was terrifying. Balls of iron smashing through wood, sending lethal splinters flying. The noise was deafening. The smoke from black powder filled the air, making it hard to see or breathe. Men screamed when they were hit. Blood made the deck slippery. But if you won, if you captured the ship, the reward made it worth the risk. That's what you told yourself anyway. And the pirate code ensured you'd get your fair share of whatever was taken. That knowledge helped you face the danger. After a successful capture, there'd be celebration. Extra rum for everyone, songs and stories late into the night. This was what you'd been working toward. This was the payoff.
And the code governed even this, making sure the celebration didn't get so out of hand that the ship became endangered.
Life under the pirate code was hard, dangerous, often miserable. But it had moments of triumph, of wealth, of freedom. You had a voice in decisions. You had guaranteed compensation if injured. You had your share of the treasure. These things made the hardship bearable for many men. As you continue this journey, imagine yourself in your hammock aboard that pirate ship. The day's work is done. You're exhausted. Your muscles ache from pulling on ropes and scrubbing decks. Your hands are rough and calloused. You smell of tar and sweat and salt water. But in your pocket is your share of the last prize. Silver coins that clink together. Proof that you're earning your way, that the system is working. Above you, the next watch is taking over. You can hear their footsteps, their voices talking quietly. The ship rocks gently. The stars are visible through the hatch. And you know that tomorrow will be more of the same. More work, more watch duty, more hardtack and salt meat. But also, more chances for prizes, for treasure, for that eventual retirement you dream about. Life under the pirate code was hard, dangerous, often miserable. But it had moments of triumph, of wealth, of freedom. You had a voice in decisions. You had guaranteed compensation if injured. You had your share of the treasure. These things made the hardship bearable for many men. But what happened when men violated these sacred rules? What punishments awaited those who broke the code they'd sworn to uphold? Now we turn to the darkest chapter of pirate justice. Picture yourself aboard a pirate ship. One of your crewmates has been caught stealing from the common pot. A handful of gold coins hidden in his sea chest. Not much, maybe 10 pieces of 8. But theft is theft. The articles are clear: marooning or execution. The crew has voted. The punishment will be marooning. And you're about to witness what that actually means. Marooning. The word sounds almost romantic, doesn't it? Like being stranded on a tropical paradise. But the reality was one of the cruelest punishments imaginable. Let me describe it in detail, because understanding this helps you understand how seriously pirates took their code. The ship would find a suitable location, not a large island with resources. No, that would be too merciful. The ideal location was a small sandbar or rocky outcrop, barely above water at high tide. No shade, no fresh water, no food, no shelter. Just bare sand or rock surrounded by ocean. The condemned man would be rowed ashore in a small boat. He'd be given minimal supplies. Different pirate codes specified different amounts, but typically you'd get a bottle of water, maybe, a bottle of rum, sometimes, a pistol with a small amount of powder and shot, and the clothes on your back. That's it. Why the pistol? Not for hunting or protection. There's nothing to hunt on a sandbar, and nothing to protect yourself from. No. The pistol was so you could kill yourself. When the thirst and heat and despair became unbearable, you could end it quickly. A single bullet, a quick death. Better than dying slowly of thirst over days. The bottle of water might last a day, maybe 2 if you rationed it carefully. The rum would actually dehydrate you faster, but it would dull the pain and fear. And then you'd sit on that sandbar under the brutal Caribbean sun, watching the horizon, hoping against hope
that a ship would appear. But ships rarely traveled near these isolated spots. That's why they were chosen. You'd die of thirst within 3 to 5 days. The sun would blister your skin, your tongue would swell. You'd become delirious, seeing things that weren't there. Eventually, you'd either use the pistol, or you'd simply expire from dehydration. Your body would be left for the gulls and crabs. This was considered worse than a quick hanging. Because you had time to think about what you'd done, about the choice you'd made to betray your crew. And you had the pistol, the terrible choice of whether to use it or endure to the bitter end. Most men used it eventually. The ones who didn't suffered longer.
John Phillips' articles specified, "If any man shall offer to run away or keep any secret from the company, he shall be marooned with 1 bottle of powder, 1 bottle of water, 1 small arm, and shot." Notice it says 1 bottle of water, not multiple bottles. 1. That's how little mercy there was for breaking the code. And pirates absolutely did maroon men. It wasn't just a threat. Captain Charles Vane was eventually marooned by his own crew, though he was lucky enough to be rescued. Edward England was marooned by his crew for showing too much mercy to captives. He also survived, making it to Madagascar. But most marooned men died alone on those desolate patches of sand and rock. The word maroon comes from the Spanish cimarron, which meant a runaway slave. It came to mean anyone abandoned on a deserted island. The English corrupted it to marooner, which became another word for pirate, because pirates marooned people so frequently. Eventually, a marooned person could be called a maroon. When honest ship captains found a marooned man, they usually assumed he was a pirate and either left him there or clapped him in irons to turn him in for a reward. There was no sympathy for marooned men. They were criminals who'd betrayed their crews. They deserved their fate. Now let's talk about other punishments. Walking the plank, that iconic pirate punishment? Largely a myth. It did happen, but very rarely. Most documented cases are from the mid to late 1700s or early 1800s, after the Golden Age of Piracy. If pirates wanted to throw someone overboard, they just threw them. No ceremony, no plank, just heave them into the sea. It was more efficient. The plank walking you see in movies was probably invented, or at least popularized, by 19th century literature. Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island mentions it several times, and J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan features Captain Hook threatening people with it. But actual Golden Age pirates? They rarely bothered with such theatrical executions. More common was keel hauling. This punishment originated with Dutch sailors, but was adopted by some pirates and many naval vessels. The victim would be tied with ropes around his wrists and ankles. Then he'd be thrown overboard and dragged along the entire length of the keel, the bottom of the ship. The keel was covered in barnacles. Sharp, razor-like barnacles. Being dragged across them would tear your clothes to shreds and your flesh with it. You'd also be underwater for the entire journey, which could take several minutes depending on the ship's size. Most men drowned before they reached the other side. Those who survived would be torn and bleeding, their wounds likely to get infected. Keel hauling was often a death sentence, though officially it was classified as a punishment short of execution. The survival rate was maybe 50-50, depending on how long the ship was and how long you could hold your breath. Pirates didn't use this punishment as much as naval vessels did, but it was in their arsenal of consequences for serious breaches of the code. For lesser offenses, there was flogging. The pirate code particularly Article 5 in most versions, specified Moses's law for certain infractions. This meant 39 lashes with a whip. Why 39? According to biblical law, 40 lashes was the maximum a man should receive. So 39 lashes was 40 lacking 1, the most you could give without breaking that biblical limit. The whip used was often a cat of 9 tails, a whip with 9 separate cords, sometimes with knots tied in them or pieces of metal woven through. This weapon didn't just bruise, it ripped flesh. After 39 lashes, your back would be a bloody mess. And the whip was rarely cleaned between victims, so your torn flesh would be contaminated with blood and filth from previous floggings. Infection was likely. Many men survived 39 lashes, though it was excruciating. Some received far more than 39 and survived, but many also died from shock, blood loss, or subsequent infection. Moses' law was serious punishment, not a slap on the wrist, and it was public. The entire crew would watch as you were bound to the mast and whipped. This served as both punishment and deterrent. The pirate code specified flogging for various offenses. Striking another crew member aboard ship, Moses' law. Neglecting to keep your weapons clean, loss of shares and possibly flogging. Smoking in the hold where gunpowder was stored, Moses' law. Carrying a lit candle without a lantern, same punishment. These rules about fire and smoking weren't arbitrary cruelty. They were essential safety regulations. One spark in the wrong place could blow up the entire ship. So the punishment had to be severe enough to make men follow the rules religiously. Lesser punishments included clapping in irons, being shackled and locked in the hold for a period of time, no food, or just hardtack and water. Chained in the dark, in the stinking bilge, listening to rats scurry around you. This was used for minor infractions, or sometimes just to cool off a troublemaker before deciding on more serious punishment. Another punishment was sweating. This was a form of running the gauntlet, but in a circle. The offender would be tied to the mast. The crew would form a circle around him and run around, each man striking him as they passed, sometimes with fists, sometimes with rope ends or belts. This would continue until the quartermaster decided the man had been punished enough. It was painful and humiliating, but rarely fatal. All these punishments were spelled out, or implied, in the pirate code, and they were enforced by the crew collectively. The captain didn't just arbitrarily whip men like captains on Royal Navy ships often did. On a pirate ship, punishments had to be approved, usually by a vote of the crew or by the captain and quartermaster together. This democratic enforcement meant punishments were seen as legitimate, not as tyranny. Now, let's talk about how different captains adapted the basic pirate code to their own circumstances. We've focused mainly on Bartholomew Roberts' articles, but other pirates had their own variations. John Phillips, who we've mentioned several times, had a particularly interesting set of articles. Phillips had been a carpenter before turning pirate. He was captured by pirates under Thomas Anstis and initially forced to join. But he grew to like the pirate life and eventually stole his own ship, renaming it Revenge. Phillips' articles were notable for their anti-rape clause, which we discussed earlier. But they also had some unique features. His Article 4 stated, "If at any time we should meet another marooner, pirate, that man that shall sign his articles without the consent of our company
shall suffer such punishment as the captain and company shall think fit. This is a bit confusing, but it basically meant that if your crew encountered another pirate crew, you couldn't just decide to join them without your current crew's permission. You were bound to your crew until they released you. This prevented men from opportunistically jumping ship whenever they thought they'd found a better situation. It maintained crew cohesion. Edward Lowe, another pirate captain, had articles that were largely identical to George Lowther's because they sailed together for a while. But Lowe was notorious for his cruelty. He didn't just follow the code, he added his own twisted punishments. He once forced a Portuguese captain to eat his own lips after Lowe cut them off. He burned a French cook alive, saying he was a greasy fellow who would fry well. He killed dozens of Spanish captives with his cutlass just for entertainment. Lowe's sadism eventually turned his own crew against him. According to some accounts, his crew mutinied, set him adrift in a small boat, and left him to die. Even pirates had limits. Wanton cruelty that served no purpose was bad for business and bad for morale. Lowe violated the spirit of the pirate code, even if he technically followed the letter. Henry Morgan, the famous buccaneer who later became Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica, had his own version of the code. His was one of the earliest recorded, appearing in Alexander X. Quemelin's 1678 book, The Buccaneers of America. Morgan's code specified compensation in both money and slaves, reflecting the earlier era when slavery was even more prevalent. Morgan was brutal to his enemies, sacking cities and torturing inhabitants to reveal where treasure was hidden. But he was fair to his crew, following his own articles religiously. This fairness, combined with his success, made him one of the most powerful buccaneer leaders of his time. Captain John Gow had a very short list of articles, only 6 rules. His code was discovered aboard his ship when he was captured in 1729. It was brutally simple. Every man shall obey his commander in all respects. Every man shall keep his watch, night and day. Any persons who shall offend against any of these articles shall be punished with death, or in such other manner as the ship's company shall think proper. Simple, direct, harsh. Gow's career was short, lasting less than a year before he was captured and hanged. His brief articles show that not all pirate codes were elaborate. Some captains kept it simple. What united all these codes was the fundamental principles we've discussed: democratic decision-making, fair distribution of plunder, compensation for injuries, and harsh but transparent punishment for violations. The specific details varied, but the core concepts remained consistent across different crews and captains. The pirate code wasn't a single document handed down from some mythical pirate king. It was a living tradition, adapted and modified by each crew to fit their needs. But it drew from common roots and served common purposes, maintaining order, ensuring fairness, maximizing effectiveness. Consider the execution of pirates at Execution Dock in London. This was where captured pirates met their end, and it was designed to be a public spectacle. The condemned would be led through the streets to Wapping, near the docks. Crowds would gather to watch. Some people would jeer and throw things. Others would be silent, perhaps sympathetic to men who'd just wanted a better life than what society offered. The execution itself was brutal. The pirate would be hanged, but not with the long drop that breaks the neck instantly. No, this was a short drop. You'd dangle there, slowly choking to death, legs kicking, face turning purple. It could take several minutes, and your body would be left hanging in chains at the dock until 3 tides had washed over it. This was the law. 3 tides, so that all sailors entering or leaving the port would see what happened to pirates. Sometimes, particularly notorious pirates would be covered in tar after death to preserve their bodies. Then they'd be hung in an iron cage called a gibbet at a prominent location. The body would hang there for years, slowly rotting until only bones remained. This served as a warning to any sailor thinking about turning pirate. This is what awaits you if you're caught.
Captain William Kidd's body hung in a gibbet for 3 years. Blackbeard's head was displayed on a pole. Bartholomew Roberts' crew, after his death, saw 52 men hanged at once in what was the largest pirate execution ever. Their bodies were displayed throughout the Caribbean. The message was clear. The age of piracy was over. But before that end came, the pirate code governed thousands of men across dozens of ships. Each captain added his own touches, but the core remained the same. Democratic voting, fair distribution, transparent rules, and harsh but predictable consequences for violations. And it worked. For a few decades, from roughly 1690 to 1730, pirates operating under these codes terrorized shipping lanes and captured thousands of vessels. They created an alternative society that, in many ways, was more democratic and egalitarian than the legitimate societies they'd fled. But it couldn't last. The major European powers eventually dedicated serious resources to stamping out piracy. Warships hunted down pirate vessels. Pirate havens like Nassau and the Bahamas were cleaned out. Captured pirates were hanged in large numbers, their bodies displayed in cages as warnings. The Golden Age of Piracy ended not because the pirate code failed, but because the world changed around it. Nations got more organized, navies got more powerful, and the opportunities for piracy diminished. By 1730, most of the famous pirate captains were dead or retired. The ones who kept trying were quickly caught and executed. But the legacy of the pirate code lived on. The ideas of democratic governance, checks and balances on power, compensation for workers, and transparent rules democratically enforced? These concepts would later appear in the American and French revolutions. Some historians argue that pirates were early pioneers of democracy, not because they intended to be, but because they stumbled upon systems that worked. As you drift toward sleep now, think about what the pirate code represented. It was brutal, yes. Men were marooned, whipped, executed for breaking rules they'd sworn to uphold. But it was also fair in its own harsh way. Every man had a voice. Every man got his share. Every man knew the rules and the consequences. The pirates weren't heroes. They were criminals who robbed, killed, and caused terror. But they were also men seeking a better life than what legitimate society offered them. And they created a system that, for all its flaws, treated them more fairly than most legitimate institutions of their time. Think about Bartholomew Roberts, capturing over 400 ships in 3 years, his crew united by a code they'd all sworn to follow. Think about John Phillips, adding anti-rape clauses after witnessing the horrors his previous captain's crew committed. Think about the common pirates, the men whose names we don't know, who signed the articles and hoped for treasure and found instead brotherhood, democracy, and often death. The pirate code was the law that governed these outlaws. It was the structure that organized this chaos. It was the fairness that made the unfairness of pirate life bearable. And for a brief, violent moment in history, it created something unique. Floating democracies ruled by men who'd sworn to treat each other as equals. As you fall asleep, let go of the violence and the brutality. Let go of the marooning and the keel hauling and the executions. Instead, hold on to the core idea that even in the most lawless corners of the world, humans seek order. That even criminals want fairness. That even pirates, those supposed villains of history, understood something important about how people should treat each other. Equal votes, fair shares, transparent rules, consequences for violations. These are principles that we still value today. The pirates didn't invent them, but they lived them in their own crude way, decades before they became mainstream. The pirate code was brutal, but it was also, in its strange way, beautiful. A glimpse of democracy in an age of absolute monarchs. A promise of fairness in an era of exploitation. A set of rules that said every man mattered, even if those men were outlaws and thieves. Rest now. The story is complete. The pirate code has been revealed in all its complexity, its brutality, its surprising fairness. Tomorrow, these men and their rules will be history. But tonight, for just a moment longer, you're there with them. Aboard that ship, bound by those articles, part of something bigger than yourself. If you liked this journey through pirate history, please like and subscribe for more historical deep dives. Leave a comment about what aspect of pirate life surprised you most. And remember, while we can learn from history, we don't have to repeat it. The pirates found ways to treat each other fairly. Maybe we can do even better. Sleep well and dream of distant shores, black flags snapping in the wind, and articles signed in blood and rum governing men who chose to live and die by their own rules. The Pirate Code. It was real. It was brutal. It was fair. It was unforgettable. Good night.